In this twisted tale, my older brother is the infamous villainous alpha. According to the plot, he will relentlessly pursue and conquer the main protagonist, only to face ruin and end up destitute. And what about my own comfort and wealth? Well, to protect my lifestyle, I intervened just as he was about to capture the protagonist. I deliberately released my omega pheromones, trapping him in the room with me. Smiling, I offered some advice. Brother, you know a forced relationship never yields sweet fruit. But in the next moment, I was surrounded by a heady, crisp scent of green grapefruit. Oh no, he was entering his susceptible period. Welcome to He History Channel. Subscribe to follow all our latest adventures. Story begins. In the dimly lit hotel room, I threw my arms around his tall figure, releasing my pheromones with reckless abandon while coaxing him earnestly. Brother, a forced relationship never ends well, you know? Omega pheromones at a sufficient concentration could disrupt an alpha's willpower. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the beautiful Omega boy still standing by the corner. I quickly whispered, "Go. Now." He gave me a startled look, his fair skin and delicate features striking even in a simple white t-shirt. He was stunning, innocent but not fragile, evoking a powerful urge to protect. No wonder my brother had fallen for him. But that didn't mean he could act on it. The boy reacted fast and escaped, shutting the door behind him. I let out a sigh of relief. But then I heard my brother's rough, labored breathing just above me. Looking up, I locked eyes with Addison Phillips, his normally sharp gaze now flushed with red, clearly infuriated. Brother, I'll stop releasing pheromones now. Just calm down, all right? I released my hold, ready to slip away. Yet, after taking only a few steps, I was enveloped in that overpowering scent of grapefruit once again. The alpha's pheromones overtook me and my knees buckled, dropping me to the floor. Trembling, I glanced back. Brother? That look nearly frightened me out of my wits. His handsome face was tinged with a strange flush, his gaze no longer clear. Instead, there was an untamed, primal desire in those dark eyes. This was bad. Could my pheromones have triggered his susceptible period ahead of schedule? Panicked, I tried to crawl toward the door, but his footsteps closed in behind me. His voice, soft yet dangerous, echoed in my ear like the devil's whisper. Weren't you the one so skilled at releasing pheromones just now? Why are you running? It was over. I was a mere extra character who had stumbled into this twisted novel by accident. Unfortunately, I wasn't a male protagonist, not even a malicious supporting character. I was just a regular bystander. A mere orphan. Growing up, Addison Phillips had been my closest ally, a gloomy, silent boy who had stayed aloof from everyone. Yet after a fateful day when I shielded him from other kids throwing stones, getting myself injured in the process, he began to soften. When he was taken in by the powerful Phillips family, he brought me along as his little brother. Time flew by, and when I turned 18, I unexpectedly differentiated as an Omega. He even said he'd help me find a reliable alpha one day. But now, all that was turning to dust. As he grabbed my ankle and dragged me back toward him, fear finally crept in. Brother, I'm sorry. Let me go, I'll fetch a suppressant for you. Had it not been for the novel's plot, where Addison Phillips becomes infatuated with the main character William Wyatt, only to suffer vengeful ruin from the protagonist, I wouldn't be in this situation. But there's no reasoning with someone in their susceptible period. The scorching breath on my neck sent a shiver down my spine. The alpha pheromone concentration in the air was overwhelming. My head felt foggy, my body heating up. A sharp pain stung the back of my neck as Addison's unique pheromones entered my system, a mingling of tart grapefruit with a hint of sweet citrus. Like an electric current, it surged through me, sending a shudder across my entire body. Unconsciously, I tilted my head back, feeling as if all my strength had been drained. Suddenly, I was lifted off the ground. Instinctively, I clung to his neck, only to be tossed onto the bed a moment later. Addison loosened his tie with a dark, predatory gaze fixed on me, like a beast eyeing its prey. My heart raced. In the dim room, I caught sight of a box of suppressants on the bedside table. Ecstatic, I shouted, "Brother, there's a suppressant. Take a breath and let's use it." I pulled out my phone, swiftly scanning the code to unlock the cabinet where the suppressant was stored. But before I could reach it, another hand, quicker than mine, snatched it up. I looked up, bewildered. "Brother, you can take it yourself?" And just when I thought everything was resolved, Addison leaned close, his breath mixing with that intense grapefruit scent by my ear. "Oswin, you're the one who provoked me first." Everything was falling apart. With my wrists pinned above my head, I met Addison's gaze filled with something deeper and darker than I'd ever seen. I wanted to cry out, "Brother, I'm Oswin, not William Wyatt." But before I could even protest, his lips covered mine. His hand, far from idle, wandered down, lingering at my waistband. My heart pounded wildly. Whose heartbeat it was, his or mine, I couldn't even tell. Just as I thought my last defenses would crumble, a sudden loud bang echoed through the room. The door burst open, startling Addison just as he pulled away. After wrapping me tightly in the covers, he turned to the intruders with a piercing gaze. In an icy tone, he asked, "Master Reagan Heckford, what brings you here?" Reagan Heckford? The lead alpha? Through the days, I caught a fleeting moment of clarity. Right, this scene had been in the plot. The villain, Addison Phillips, attempts to forcibly claim the protagonist, only to be stopped by Reagan just in time. But William was supposed to be safe already, wasn't he? Peeking out from the blanket, I saw Reagan, tall and stern, his gaze sharp as a hawk's, formidable in every aspect. Addison, still in his susceptible period, radiated fury and tension as their eyes met. Just then, a familiar figure appeared behind Reagan, William Wyatt himself. His face was full of concern as he looked at me, wrapped in blankets, and he mouthed a silent reassurance, "Don't worry." I immediately understood. He probably thought I would face Addison's wrath for letting him escape, so he brought help. But why did I suddenly feel a chill down my spine? As I glanced nervously at Addison, I met a gaze that promised a storm. "Oswin," he called out in a disturbingly calm voice, even pulling a smile. "Do you know these people?" I was doomed. Knowing Addison as well as I did, I could tell he was at the peak of his rage. And everyone knew the villain and the main lead were arch-enemies. If he suspected I was friendly with Reagan, or worse, that I'd helped William escape, I'd be lucky to get away unscathed. I quickly shook my head and turned to William, forcing out an explanation. "You're mistaken. I stayed because he entered his susceptible period, and I needed to look after him." William's gaze flickered with disbelief, sweeping between Addison's icy face and me. Reagan, however, smirked, his eyes filled with mockery as he remarked, "Since Phillips has someone, he shouldn't covet others." With that, he led William out, deliberately taking William's hand in front of Addison. As the door closed, silence fell over the room. Terrified, I looked back. Instead of a storm, Addison's expression remains unreadably calm. But if looks could kill, I imagine Reagan Heckford would have been dead 100 times over by now. Fortunately, his timely intrusion seemed to clear the tension that had lingered in the room. Seizing the chance, I swiftly grabbed the suppressant and, noticing Addison's still brooding expression, offered some advice with a sigh. "Brother, forcing someone never works. If you truly like him, you need to go slow, show him kindness." Addison's gaze turned slowly to me, his dark eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. After a pause, he spoke, his voice low, "Am I not good enough?" I blinked. What? Charging at someone straight off the bat doesn't exactly count as being good, now does it? Honestly, I was tempted to say he should be grateful he wasn't reported. Though I thought that, I merely nodded with a placating smile. Yes, you're the best in the world, brother." Despite his villainous streak, he was still my brother, so naturally, I'd indulge him a little. I handed him the suppressant. "Come on, just take it already." The pheromone levels in the room were so high I was getting lightheaded. If this continued, even I wouldn't be able to hold myself together. With a reluctant expression, Addison finally took the suppressant from my hand. Once he administered it, the potent scent of grapefruit in the air began to fade. I lifted the blanket and started to leave, but before I could finish my sentence, he pulled me back into his arms through the covers. His low voice tickled my ear. "Didn't you say you'd take care of me? Release some of your pheromones." I stammered, realizing he wouldn't let this slide. During an alpha's susceptible period, omega pheromones could indeed be calming. I didn't have much choice. "Oh, all right." The sweet scent of citrus slowly filled the air, mingling with his grapefruit. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, until exhaustion took over and I drifted off to sleep. Little did I know that, beside me, Addison was struggling, his breathing growing heavy as he released his hold on me, pressing a hand over his eyes to maintain control. The alpha's susceptible period could last several days. Even after taking the suppressant, Addison's emotions remained unstable, forcing him to stay home from work. I initially suggested returning home, where the housekeeper could help care for him, but he refused, simply staring at me with an unwavering gaze. Feeling guilty, I looked away, knowing I had caused his premature susceptible period. So, I stayed in the hotel with him, releasing pheromones to calm him as his living, breathing pillow. It took an entire week before he finally stabilized. On the morning his susceptible period ended, I woke up to find the space beside me empty. I sat up, glancing at the vacant spot next to me, and felt an inexplicable pang in my chest. Shaking my head, I brushed it off as nonsense. A text alert pulled me out of my thoughts. Grabbing my phone, I saw a message from Addison. "I'm off to work. Have breakfast at the hotel before you head home." I replied with a cat emoji. "Got it." He immediately responded with another, showing a big cat patting a smaller one. The gesture was surprisingly tender. My heart skipped a beat, though I brushed it off, blaming my overactive imagination. Over the next few weeks, I didn't see him. Word had it he was on a business trip, tied up with a project. At first, his absence felt strange, but I adjusted quickly, throwing myself into preparations for the new school term. I had recently been accepted to a university, and though I'd spent years with Addison, I still remembered the orphanage director's words. Only by becoming a person of value could I avoid being discarded. The day my scores came out, Addison seemed genuinely pleased. He'd probably been relieved I hadn't embarrassed him. The morning of my first day arrived. I had prepared myself to head to school alone, but when I finished packing and went downstairs, there he was, Addison, seated on the sofa with a laptop on his knees, looking as intense as ever while speaking into his headset. Hearing my footsteps, he looked up and paused, quickly wrapping up his call. Closing the laptop, he stood and walked over, taking my suitcase. "Got everything you need?" I nodded, feeling a bit sheepish at his stern demeanor. "Brother, if you're busy, don't worry about me. I can go alone." He frowned, looking almost hurt. "What are you saying? Work isn't more important than taking you to school. Let's go." Without waiting, he led the way to the door. "Oh, right." I hurried after him, stunned by his dedication. Addison personally drove me to the university. When we arrived, he parked and carried my bags himself, walking me through the campus with the grace of an older brother rather than a sibling. His words trailed behind me as he lectured me about reaching out if I faced any issues. Standing in the sunlight, his face softened, showing a warmth I hadn't expected. For a moment, a strange feeling tugged at my heart, a twinge of something bittersweet. Before, during my last life, I'd gone to university alone. No one had come to see me off, and no one cared to offer advice. But now, things felt different, as though I had someone looking out for me. Lost in thought, I must not have replied because Addison turned, brows raised. "Well?" I blinked and grinned. "Yes, brother." Seeing my smile, he relaxed, his own lips curving in response. But just as we finished registration and arrived at my dorm, I opened the door and froze. Seated at the desk was a familiar face, earphones on, a serene expression framed by delicate features. There was no mistaking him, William Wyatt. I instinctively glanced sideways. Sure enough, Addison's gaze had locked onto William. Any joy I felt at his presence instantly faded, replaced by a pang of disappointment. Hearing us, William looked up, eyes brightening when he saw me. But then his gaze shifted to Addison, and his tentative smile vanished. Still, he greeted me warmly. "You're here." Caught off guard, I merely nodded. What ridiculous fate. At least this was the school, and there were others around. Addison didn't say much, only looking at William with a calm intensity, before turning to me with a few parting reminders. Then he left. I watched his figure retreat before quickly starting to unpack. William removed his earphones and walked over, his gentle voice brushing past me like a breeze. "Need a hand?" As charming as he was, I shook my head. "No, I'm fine." Our paths were different now. Addison may have been a villain, but he was my brother, and my loyalty would always lie with him. With his relentless persistence, I knew there would be another confrontation. And next time, I might not be able to stop him. After the first week, we had our first gym class. Addison frequently texted me, asking about my school life, and even video called me in the evenings. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the calls increased, I began to wonder, was he trying to spy on William's dorm life through me? Realizing this, I started excusing myself from video calls, claiming training fatigue. It wasn't that I didn't want to chat, it was his dangerous intentions that worried me. One evening, as I was heading to the cafeteria with my roommate Thomas Clark, he slung an arm over my shoulder, grinning. "Oswin, you really need to bulk up. We may be omegas, but we can't slack off on physical training." I glared at him, half jokingly. "Right, you're such a strong omega." This was torture in this heat. Honestly, even a dog would be panting by now. Laughing, Thomas suddenly spotted something and bolted. "Oh, hell no. That guy's here too? I can't let him find out I turned out an omega." I barely had time to process what was happening before Thomas was gone. Turning around, I caught sight of a tall, lanky guy striding by, clearly chasing after Thomas. Young people? They still had the energy to sprint after gym class. I had almost reached the cafeteria when I overheard a group of students talking. "Did you see? Phillips Senpai is on campus." "Phillips Senpai? Addison Phillips? Where indeed?" Dread flooded my chest as I realized what was happening. Rushing back to the dorms, my heart sank when I caught a familiar scent, sweet gardenia mixed with grapefruit. My fears were confirmed. The scent was unmistakable. A mix of William Wyatt and Addison Phillips' pheromones lingered in the air. I hurried forward, but suddenly, my knees buckled. A shiver shot down my spine, and I pressed a hand against the wall to steady myself, gasping for air as a sweet citrus scent spread around me. Damn it. Of all times to go into my own heat. With no suppressant on hand, I barely managed to reach the door. Just as I was about to open it, I heard William Wyatt's weak voice from inside. "Addison Phillips, don't come any closer." A sharp cry followed. My hand dropped from the doorknob, lashes trembling. Too late. I hadn't made it in time. A heavy weight seemed to settle over my chest, making it hard to breathe. But with my body heating up rapidly, I couldn't afford to dwell on it. Right now, I needed to get to the infirmary for a suppressant. As I turned to leave, the door suddenly opened. "Oswin, where are you going?" I froze, recognizing that voice. Turning, I saw Addison Phillips standing there, perfectly composed, not a hair out of place. He looked nothing like someone who had been up to anything dubious. "What?" I blinked in confusion. What was going on? He stepped closer, his familiar grapefruit scent enveloping me, and I struggled to keep from collapsing into his arms. "Brother, you didn't do anything to William Wyatt, did you?" "William Wyatt?" Addison's brow furrowed, and he replied nonchalantly, "I came looking for you, and when I saw him in heat, I gave him a suppressant." Didn't want him to affect you. I also called Reagan Heckford to come pick him up. Just that? It didn't make sense. This was the perfect opportunity for him to act, wasn't it? He'd called Reagan Heckford? Since when did villains like Addison Phillips act so proper? Noticing my dazed expression, he reached out, placing a cool hand against my forehead. His voice dropped to a low murmur. "Why is your face so red?" The coolness of his palm was soothing, and I instinctively leaned into his touch, feeling my last bit of restraint crumble. "Brother, do you have any more suppressant? Please give me a dose." With my heat in full swing, I could feel my face flush, and my gaze grew hazy. I didn't realize how I must have looked to him, but in the corridor's dim light, Addison's gaze grew darker, his Adam's apple bobbing. "The suppressant's out," he said, his voice rough. "We're going home." I didn't question him, nodding weakly. "Are at home?" On the drive, my thoughts grew foggy, drifting in and out. By the time we arrived, I realized we weren't at the villa but at one of Addison's apartments near his office. I'd been here a few times, but this time, I felt a bit dazed as he lifted me from the car. "Brother, why are we here?" I mumbled, vaguely recalling that he usually stayed at the family villa with me. "This place is closer, and you have classes tomorrow," he replied matter-of-factly, ushering me inside. "Right, school." I could barely care about that now as I sank into his bed, which was decorated in his usual minimalistic style, gray tones and clean lines that felt soothing. I kicked off my shoes and buried my head into the pillow, too overwhelmed by the heat to think straight. "Brother, the suppressant." Silence stretched behind me. Just as I noticed something was off, a weight settled on the bed, and his presence loomed over me. The strong scent of grapefruit wrapped around me like a blanket, making me both comfortable and helpless. I tried to wriggle away, but my strength was no match for his. "Addison Phillips." "Don't move," he murmured, his voice hoarse. I heard that a temporary mark works better than a suppressant. The next moment, I felt his warm breath on the back of my neck, followed by the prick of his teeth sinking into the gland. A soft gasp escaped my lips as I pressed my face into the pillow, feeling an involuntary shudder ripple through me. But instead of letting up, he bit harder, as if he intended to consume me completely, pouring more of his pheromones into me with every second. Tears welled in my eyes, trailing down as I whimpered, "It hurts." "Good boy," he whispered. He was right. A temporary mark was far more effective than a suppressant. The next day, I found myself on the field for gym class under the blazing sun. Despite my irritation, my hand kept drifting to the back of my neck, where a faint soreness lingered. Thomas Clark, my classmate, leaned in, sniffing. "Hey, Oswin, are you carrying an alpha's scent?" "Oh, it's my brother's," I replied, not realizing how it sounded. "I went into heat so he helped me out." "Addison only did it because he liked William Wyatt, right? He probably just didn't want my classes disrupted." Thomas gaped at me, then muttered, "Good brothers do that? So maybe I was about to ask him what he meant when a beta girl chimed in enthusiastically. "Oh my gosh. So it's like stepbrother vibes?" I waved my hands frantically. No, we're not related by blood." She looked even more thrilled. "That's even better. Fake stepbrothers are such a vibe. Count me in as a fan." Thankfully, the next few days went by uneventfully, and I managed to survive gym class without triggering another heat. That night, after a group sing-along, we all gathered on the lawn, chatting and relaxing. Thomas was the first to jump up. "Hey, let's go somewhere to celebrate surviving gym." "Who's in?" William Wyatt joined in with a smile. "Where should we go? What about a little bar nearby? Or maybe karaoke," suggested Waldo Harris, a tall alpha who had been my friend in high school but had grown distant since my differentiation as an omega. "Let's go for drinks," Thomas decided, looking at me and William. "You guys in?" I shrugged. William seemed okay with it too. And so, we headed to a nearby bar. Waldo sat beside me, handing me a cocktail. It's been a while, Oswin. I glanced at him. Waldo had the athletic build of a former jock, his tan skin and sharp gaze striking under the bar lights. I'd heard he had quite a fan base on campus. Yeah, I replied, taking a sip, glancing over to see William Wyatt with his soft, pale features and long lashes catching the light. Just sitting there, he drew every eye in the room, a fact that stirred an odd frustration in me. Why couldn't I look that effortlessly good? After a few drinks, my thoughts grew hazy. Waldo offered to walk me outside, his alpha scent, like red wine, enveloping me. I tried to push him away, mumbling, "It's fine, I'll call my brother." But Waldo's voice sounded almost resentful. "Oswin, do you know why I distanced myself?" Why? I blinked as his face wavered in my blurry vision. "Because of your brother." He didn't get to finish. The next moment, a familiar, overpowering grapefruit scent filled the air, and I was pulled into Addison's warm, protective embrace. I looked up, smiling groggily. "Brother?" Addison's expression was stormy as he cast a cold glance at Waldo before picking me up. "We're going home." Settling into his arms felt natural. Behind us, Waldo called out bitterly, "He thinks of you as a brother." Addison ignored him, and I didn't respond either. If I didn't think of Addison Phillips as a brother, what else could I think of him as? By the time we arrived at his apartment, it was late. Insisting I needed a shower, I headed straight for the bathroom. After a long day, I couldn't stand the thought of going to bed with the sweat clinging to me. Addison Phillips hesitated, but with my insistence, he finally let me into the shower. Warm water cascaded down, and the alcohol's haze lifted somewhat. Just as I was about to put on my clothes, my legs gave way, a familiar tingling spreading from my spine. A loud thud echoed as I braced myself against the sink, accidentally knocking over the soap dispenser. The next moment, the bathroom doors swung open with force. I spun around, eyes wide. Addison stood there, gaze scanning over me, his voice hoarse. "Is it your heat again?" Hearing his voice, I snapped back to my senses, quickly turning away and scrambling to pull on my clothes. Once I'd slipped on my underwear, I feigned calmness. "Brother, could you give me another mark?" Temporary marks really did work better than suppressants, lasting for several extra days. But with my heat cycle still ongoing, the mark's effect had faded, triggering another wave. I waited, but there was no movement behind me. Glancing back, I found his dark eyes trained on me, intense and unreadable. "Brother?" At my voice, something flickered in his gaze. He sighed, wrapping a robe around me before asking, his tone softer, "Oswin Miller, do you know what marking means?" It was the first time he'd ever addressed me by my full name. I flinched. Growing up in the orphanage, I'd studied relentlessly, desperate to prove my worth and avoid being looked down upon. Even after being brought into this world, I was always afraid of embarrassing Addison, always afraid of being cast out by the Phillips family. Of course, I knew what a mark between an alpha and an omega signified. It was an act reserved for those who loved each other. But that knowledge meant nothing if he didn't feel the same for me. I forced a laugh. "Brother, didn't you say temporary marks work better than suppressants?" "They do," he replied, his voice steady. "But there's more to it than that." "More?" I stammered, not daring to look at him. Through the misty air, his words reached me clearly. "I don't know what you've misunderstood, but I don't like William Wyatt. We've only met a few times, and he's Reagan Heckford's interest, not mine. I don't need to complicate things that way. Oswin, the only person I've ever wanted has always been you." A sudden burst of fireworks seemed to go off in my mind. What did he just say? Did the villain truly like a nobody like me? But I remembered something else and blurted out, "Then, why did you take William Wyatt to the hotel that time?" Addison seemed unfazed by my question. I was coming up on my susceptible period after an event, so I booked a room to rest. He wandered in for reasons I can't fathom. "I hadn't even kicked him out before you showed up." I clung to his words, processing them. So, he was already close to his susceptible period back then? Seeing my expression, he cleared his throat, a blush coloring his ears. It wasn't supposed to start that soon. But when you arrived, I couldn't hold back. The air filled with the rich, citrusy scent of my pheromones, stirring something restless within me. Suddenly emboldened, I rose to my toes, kissing him. His pupils dilated before he wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me close. I could hardly remember how we went from a temporary mark to tangled sheets. All I knew was the sensation of his lips moving from the nape of my neck downwards, and before long, the last of my clothes lay discarded. The ceiling light above us swayed, a rhythm matching our movements. It wasn't until dawn broke across the sky that I finally drifted off, my mind floating to a memory. In the orphanage, despite all odds, I'd managed to adapt quickly, even after getting hit by a car and thrown into this new world. I'd taken every chance to help the director, to earn treats I'd later give to the young Addison Phillips, hoping to make him smile and gain a little extra strength. Though it began with a selfish desire to stick close to him because I knew he was a Phillips, he'd remained blissfully unaware. I remembered the day he found out the treat was limited to one per person. He refused to eat it from then on. And when I got hurt protecting him, he didn't leave my side, losing sleep in worry. When I'd awoken, they told me he'd swallowed his pride to beg the director for a doctor. Later, he'd retaliated against the kids who hurt me, earning himself a stint in solitary. I still remembered how terrified he was of the dark. Rushing to find him afterward, I'd found him pale as a ghost. But he'd only asked, "Does your head still hurt?" My tears had come instantly, and I'd thrown myself into his arms, calling him brother. He'd held me close, whispering, "Now that you call me brother, you're mine." And he kept his word. When the Phillips family came to bring him back, he held my hand firmly, demanding, "Fine, but I'm taking him with me." The Phillips family had initially refused but finally relented to his determination. In the 10 years that followed, I'd seen Addison exhausted, frustrated, furious at subordinates. Yet he'd never allowed a single hardship to fall upon me. Suddenly, all the confusion, the bittersweet pangs, and the bouts of jealousy I'd felt over the years made sense. Somewhere along the way, I'd fallen for him too. When I finally woke, it was noon, and I expected Addison to have left for work. But opening my eyes, I found myself staring directly into his face, close enough to count each of his lashes. "Brother?" As my thoughts returned, so did the ache in my body, making me wince with each shift. He noticed and leaned closer, worry clouding his gaze as he reached for the blanket. "Where does it hurt?" I grabbed the covers, face flushing. "Nowhere. I'm fine." At least he'd been gentle last night, though I felt like I'd run a marathon. Seeing my awkwardness, he exhaled in relief. "Are you hungry? I'll grab you something to eat." I nodded and tried to stand, but my legs wobbled beneath me. Behind me, I heard a stifled chuckle. I glared at him, and he composed himself, stepping over to lift me into his arms and carry me to the bathroom. I accepted his help, content to let him care for me. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a familiar-looking package in the trash. It was the same one he'd picked up that day in the hotel room. So he'd intended to mark me all along? Things were absurd, but oddly enough, it all made sense. He still clashed with Reagan Heckford now and then, but his company remained stable, certainly not heading toward any downfall. After that night, he forbade me from calling him brother. Well, except during certain times. 2 years passed in a flash, and by junior year, I'd completed all my credits. During my internship at Phillips Corporation, I bubbled with excitement. "Brother, you'll be able to take it easy soon." There was no point in waiting for luck. I'd work hard, not only for myself but so I could stand alongside him as his equal. Behind his desk, Addison's features had sharpened over the years, giving him an even more striking, mature look. Hearing my words, he raised his head, a softness entering his gaze as he motioned for me to come closer. When I reached him, he pulled me into his arms, his deep voice whispering in my ear. As long as you're here with me, I'm happy. Warmth surged through me, melting away the loneliness and guardedness that had built up over the years. But before I could get too sentimental, his breath heated my neck. Sensing danger, I stammered, "Bro, brother, I should get to work." "No rush. Let's start with a temporary mark." The curtains fell, and the office soon filled with the soft sounds of my muffled voice. Who takes off their clothes just for a temporary mark, anyway? Extra. Addison Phillips' perspective. The moment Addison Phillips laid eyes on William Wyatt, a strange memory surfaced in his mind. In this memory, despite knowing that William was Reagan Heckford's favored Omega, he felt an inexplicable attraction and tried to claim him by force. But he was interrupted by Reagan, who came just in time to rescue the Omega. Afterward, he'd embarked on a reckless vendetta against Reagan, even going to extremes with William Wyatt, which eventually led to his own ruin and disgrace. How utterly absurd! Why would he forsake the treasure he'd raised since childhood to chase after his rival's interest? He wasn't insane. The realization was immediate. He'd miscalculated. He'd been about to throw William out when Oswin arrived, clinging to him and flooding the room with comforting pheromones. Already close to his susceptible period, Addison lost control at Oswin's touch. Once William was gone, he hadn't been able to restrain himself, embracing Oswin and biting down on his nape. His original plan was to drive off any alphas lingering around Oswin, win his heart, and take things slow, just as Oswin had suggested. But Oswin had come to him willingly. He would have claimed him right there if Reagan Heckford hadn't interrupted them. Still, Addison got his chance in the end. Afterward, seeing William in heat, he had given him a suppressant and called Reagan to collect him. If he couldn't enjoy the feast before him, he might as well make sure Reagan shared the misery. Unexpectedly, Oswin entered heat that night too. In a soft voice, he'd asked, "Brother, do you have a suppressant for me as well?" Though Addison had a suppressant on him, he chose to lie. "It's all out. We're going home." In that moment he had only one thought. He wanted to mark Oswin. And he wanted it desperately. The end.
Thanks for stopping by. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos.